Good morning. We're here for a beautiful damn sunrise in Oklahoma. Thank you for being with me. We got cut short yesterday from our book that I've been reading, The Warrior Queens. It was a little over an hour, so I guessed it was probably time when we got cut off yesterday. So I'm going to backtrack a little. He did not cease, excuse me, Lord. He did not cease to implore with many tears the apostolic clemency, so that all present were found marveling at our unusual hardness of heart. But outside Canossa, while still under ban, Henry for the time being had no choice but to persevere. I'm reading to you about Matilda, daughter of Peter. We're on page 144. Finally, on the fourth day, the shivering emperor was allowed to throw himself at the Pope's feet and receive mercy. Even so, his absolution was in theory granted to him only as a man, not as a king. That would still have to wait for a conference at Augsburg, although the conference never took place, and Gregory did refer to Henry as king after Canossa. It was undoubtedly, at first sight, a sensational victory for Gregory, for all that Henry did not keep his word regarding the notorious investitures. Strife between Pope and Emperor persisted well into the next century. He had at least been obliged to bow his neck to the Pope's authority on this single, most celebrated occasion. The Emperor had, in short, come to Canossa, and so that famous phrase, signifying the recantation of a previous proudly held position for humbling oneself on a grand scale, was born. Woo! It's pretty. Furthermore, Canossa, where it all happened, was the stronghold not of a prince or bishop, but of a woman. No wonder that Canossa, with its infinite possibilities of defense, was the favored residence of Matilda. This extra bit of symbolism concerning Canossa's female ownership is, however, generally missing from the catchphrase which has come down to us. The practical triumph of Pope Gregory was short-lived. The last years of his life were spent in an unenviable series of confrontations with the emperor, ending with Gregory's death in exile at Salerno, while an anti-pope, Clement III, Henry's nominee, occupied St. Peter's. Civil war in Germany, where the princes persisted in electing a new king in Rudolph of Swabia, despite the lifting of the ban on Henry, occupied the emperor until 1080. After that, Rudolph's death in battle freed him to return across the Alps to Italy, and after ravaging the north, besiege Rome itself. Here, with William I of England and Philip of France carefully neutral, Matilda was, as Donizeau put it, the only soldier of St. Peter left. Nor had her own affairs prospered since Canossa. The rising Tuscan cities, in particular Lucca, were beginning to desert her cause, since the townsmen, wanting independence, regarded the hereditary ruler of Tuscany as their natural foe. On his return, Henry marched on Lucca, had Matilda judged guilty of high treason for refusing feudal alliance to him, and placed her under the ban of empire, which meant that all her goods were confiscated. On the papal side, there was nothing but praise for the sturdiness with which Matilda met the fate which her loyalties to the Holy Father had brought about. Anselm of Lucca, the Pope's vicar in Lombardy, praised the heroic countess for amassing eternal treasure in heaven by her efforts, confident that she would fight with her blood until God delivered over his enemy, Henry, into the hands of a woman. But the fact was that Matilda's earthly treasure was fast diminishing as a result of her ceaseless campaigns, a fact recognized by Pope Gregory when he pleaded for assistance for our daughter Matilda. Otherwise, she would be forced to make peace with Henry or lose all her possessions. By the spring of 1082, Matilda's finances were in ruins, and much of the gold and silver in the treasury at Canossa had to be melted down to remedy them. Yet still, according to Rangerius, Matilda feared neither dark nor cold, and nothing separated her from her soldiers. Nor did she retreat into neutrality. Matilda's military triumph at Sorbara in July 1084 was a bright spark in the increasing gloom of the papal fortunes. At Easter, the anti-pope Clement III had crowned Henry at Rome, with Pope Gregory held in the Holy City. Subsequently, the Norman leader Robert Guiscard liberated Gregory and took him back with him to Salerno, where he died the next year. Robert Guiscard also sacked the Holy City, causing the emperor to flee. North of Rome, however, Henry's allies continued to harry Matilda's possessions. Her castle of Sorbara on the plain, about 15 kilometers northeast of Modena, seemed an ideal target to invest because of its accessibility compared to, for example, Canossa. Matilda retaliated with a surprise attack late at night when the enemy soldiers were asleep. The celebrated war cry, "For St. Peter and Matilda," rang out as Matilda personally led her small force to victory. According to tradition, she carried the terrible sword of Boniface, i.e. her father's sword, as she massacred the enemy, standing in her stirrups before her troops. Militarily, one Sorbara did not make a summer, however satisfying to Matilda. The Emperor Henry continued to ravage her possessions. It is indeed the stoical resistance of Matilda to the idea of making peace with Henry, because it necessitated recognizing the anti-pope Clement III, which compels admiration over the next 15 years of her life. As the champion of St. Peter, she tried in vain to persuade Gregory's short-lived successor, Pope Victor, to take up residence in Rome. Then the succession of Odo, the former Prior of Cluny, as Urban II in 1088 brought about the second great partnership of Holy Father and armed daughter. It was Pope Urban who, in the need for allies, recognized that Matilda's theoretical marriageability must be employed once more in the cause of Christ. In 1089, the 43-year-old Matilda was married to the 17-year-old Welf V of Bavaria, thus introducing Bavaria into the Papal Alliance. The fury with which Henry IV greeted the match demonstrates the success of the move on the political level. In the case of the participants, Matilda's personal reluctance was probably equaled by that of the youthful Welf. Some 6 years later, he separated from his masterful bride, his senior by a whole generation, tired of her dominance in the calls of papal politics. As for Matilda, various suitors had been mentioned for her hand over the years since Godfrey the Hunchback's death, without conclusion. It was significant that her second marriage was not only arranged by the Pope, but arranged for the benefit of his cause. To that kind of marriage, Matilda could agree. There was a moment after Henry had taken Mantua in 1091, followed by Ferrara and other important Italian cities, when peace was once more proposed with Tuscany's Grand Contessa. If only she would acknowledge Gilbert of Ravenna as Pope Clement III. There were by now many who begged her to accede. "You have struggled long enough, oh, most valiant lady, you and your serene consort, to uphold the dignity of the pontificate." Matilda's reaction can, however, be most closely gauged by an outburst at the same council of war held in the Apennines by one Hermit John. "Are you not that Matilda who glories in the title of daughter of Peter? ... What sort of peace can be made with that impious?" No peace was made. It took a series of deaths, marking the passing of a whole generation who had lived most of their lives entrenched in conflict, to pave the way for Matilda's comparatively serene old age. Pope Urban II died in 1099, and the anti-Pope Clement III in 1100. Lastly, the death of Matilda's old enemy Henry IV in 1106 ushered in a new era. The Concordat of Worms of 1122, a compromise by which a clear distinction was made between a prelate's position as a landed vassal of the crown and his spiritual office, was hammered out toward the end of the reign of his son and successor Henry V. The new age was dawning in more senses than one. Matilda continued to regard the struggles of the Italian cities for independence as part of her own struggle to establish a free papacy. She had been born too soon, or had spent too much of her life in conflict, to understand that as the commercial importance of Pisa and Lucca developed, this was a phenomenon in its own right. And yet, as a governor, she was far from being naturally despotic. She patronized jurists such as Ubaldo de Carpeniti and Irnerius, Irnerius, One has the sad impression that Matilda's long fights with the Empire, while granting her her reputation in the pantheon of warrior queens, actually robbed Tuscany of the possibility of strong, intelligent, and benevolent female rule over 30 years. The new Emperor Henry treated Matilda toward the end of her life courteously. He called upon her at Bianello, the sentinel fortress of Canossa, where once his father had set off to shiver in the snow, swearing in the whole earth there could not be found a princess her equal. But Matilda, as her health failed, spent more and more time in Pollerone, a Benedictine monastery near Mantua, founded by her grandfather. Although when there was an uprising in the city of Mantua in 1114, this gallant old lady still threatened to command an army against the unruly townsfolk. Pollerone had been the first northern Italian monastery to accept the reformed Cluniac rule. Both Anselm of Lucca and Matilda's second spiritual advisor, Bernard of Vallombrosa, had been monks at Pollerone. The illuminated so-called Matildine Gospels, presented by the Countess to Pollerone, now in New York, in the Pierpont Morgan Library, commemorate not only her generosity towards the monastery, but also in the nature of their illustrations, those spiritual sympathies which Pope Gregory and Pope Urban had inculcated. It was in Pollerone that Matilda died on 15th of July, 1115, in her 70th year, leaving Donizeau, his biographical poem, unpresented, to repine. Now that thou art dead, O great Matilda, the honor and dignity of Italy will decline. It is, however, a curious postscript to the life of Matilda that her testamentary dispositions brought about considerable trouble for the Emperor Henry V, and also for the Pope. The Countess, childless if not virgin, left no direct heir, since with her own death her family died out. Thus, in two separate wills of 1077 and 1102, Matilda had transferred all her alloidal property, that is, the Canossa inheritance, not within the feudal structure of the empire, to the chair of St. Peter. After peace was made with Henry V, Matilda willed her feudally held possessions back to him, although Henry seized the opportunity to claim the whole of her territories. This left the Pope, at the next moment of strength, to claim Matilda's alloidal property in his turn. Ironically enough, even in death, Matilda, the warrior queen, in the course of peace, had not brought about the tranquility between Emperor and Pope, which she so ardently desired for the sake of the Holy Father. Countess Matilda was originally buried at the monastery, but in the 17th century her body was transported to St. Peter's, surely the appropriate resting place for her who had been the Pope's handmaid. Certainly, the daughter of Peter would have been a more comforting title in death to the Countess herself than that allusion to Panacea inscribed on her original tomb. First of the 3 Latin inscriptions contained this passage: "This warrior woman disposed her troops in the Amazonian Peninsula, is accustomed to do, thanks to her, through so many contests of horrid war, man was never able to conquer the rights of God. And yet, whatever the pious Matilda's reactions, there remained the need to compare one warrior queen to another, for verification, as it were, however far-fetched the comparison. Anselm of Lucca himself, in her lifetime, compared Matilda to the Amazonian queen. He also compared her to the Queen of Sheba. Where Matilda was concerned, however, Anselm was careful to add that the garb of the Panthylislia hid the messenger of mercy. That is, on the judgment seat, God would see in Matilda not the stern avenger of crime, but rather the compassionate mother of the feeble and oppressed. For another perceived need was to prevent Matilda losing her proper femininity due to her military command. Matilda's latter-day reputation includes a possible tribute from Dante in the Purgatorio, the Lady Beautiful, encountered beside the waters of Lethe, who draws him through its drenching waves to the blessed shore, is named Matilda, although there are other, more likely claimants for the poet's inspiration. A more valiant and thus more verisimilitudinous picture emerges from Tasso in Jerusalem Delivered. So this is titled Jerusalem Delivered, seems to be. With man-like vigor shone her noble look, and more than man-like wrath her face o'erspread. Henry the Fourth she beat, and from him took its standard, and in church it offered, which done, the Pope back to the Vatican she brought, and placed in Peter's chair again. In general, however, the many tributes to Matilda, both in her lifetime and afterwards, down to the 20th century biographies of the Countess, are careful to stress the compassionate side of her nature. Like Boadicea, she has excused the final responsibilities for her actions and their consequences by her sex. At Sabara, for example, the warrior maid with the terrible sword of Boniface raised above her head was also depicted as begging a halt to the slaughter once the fortress was surprised. Slaughter, it could be plausibly argued, that she herself had initiated. Her heart did not grow hard. She cared for the sick, nursed the wounded, made bandages and dressings, prepared and distributed food, and nourished and clothed the destitute, dispossessed by the German scourge. So runs a hagiographical modern life of Matilda, published in Italy in 1937. The judgment, delivered by Leone Tondelli in his classic modern biography of Matilda, which has ran through many revised editions since its first publication in 1915, is on firmer ground, for throughout it stresses the religious inspiration, which not only supported Matilda in her so many contests of horrid war, but also justified her participation in them to her contemporaries. The Countess Matilda, wrote Tondelli, was a heroine of Christian Italy. Her whole life constituted luminous proof that if a Christian upbringing tends with modest self-effacement, self-reflection, and a mystical union with God to elevate the refine the spirit, it nevertheless does not take away any vigor in action. Most significantly of all, it is to Matilda's Christian upbringing that Tondelli ascribes the martial ability so uncharacteristic of her sex. In moments of need, Tondelli continues, such an upbringing can suggest, even to a woman's heart, the heroism of chivalry, and it can mold the female soul, usually rich in generosity, but little resistant to long-lasting tests. Shades here of Gibbon and Mommsen on the subject of Zenobia. Into an indomitable consistency, one feels that is a judgment with which the Grand Contessa herself, Matilda by the grace of God, or she is nothing, would have agreed. And that is the end of chapter 9, Matilda, daughter of Peter. Our chapter 10 will be England's Domina. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you.